You're listening to Terror in Wichita, where we walk you through the story of the brutal murders in Wichita. Narrated by Max Bowen, written by Paul Caranci, and edited and produced by Skylar Batz.
Chapter 5: The Aftermath. Friday, December 15th, 2000. Approximately 2:18 a.m. to 2:45 a.m. After leaving their victims for dead and disposing of the murder weapon, the Carr brothers returned to the condominium at 12727 Birchwood Drive. They needed to retrieve the tan Toyota, but also planned to quickly steal anything of value that remained in the condo before heading to their respective domiciles. Entering the house, one of the brothers went downstairs and grabbed the large telescope, while the other went into Jason's bedroom to seize the jar of coins and the popcorn tin that contained the diamond ring. That's where he encountered Nicky, HG's little schnauzer. The dog barked and nipped at the intruder's ankles. It quickly became an annoyance to the burglar, who grabbed the golf club used to beat Jason and Aaron and slammed it down hard on the dog's neck. The blow caused a severe injury, almost separating the dog's head from the spinal cord and vertebrae. He then grabbed some sharp, pointy object that was within reach and stabbed the dog in the neck, leaving it dead on the floor. After taking what they could, the two cold-blooded murdering thieves headed home. The investigation. Approximately 2:45 a.m. The 911 dispatcher had already alerted police to the major details of HG's call, and separate units were responding to the Johnson home, where HG waited, the victim's home, and the soccer field. Deputy Sheriff Matthew Lynch of the Sedgwick County Police Department was the first to arrive at the execution site. He immediately observed a lone Honda sitting to his west. He exited the vehicle and tactically approached the Honda. Dispatch had broadcast that the possible homicide suspects were at the intersection of 37th and Greenwich, so Lynch had no way of knowing if they were still in the area. He did know, however, that no one else would be checking in on this call. He was alone and not about to take any foolish chances. As he edged closer to the Honda, he began to notice the bodies, thinking to himself that it looked like something out of a movie set. He first saw two male bodies lying in the snow, with a third body lying across them. Lying to the left of the male bodies was a fourth body, this one female. Then there was a gap with a blood spot missing in the snow, signaling that someone was missing. Lynch sprang into action. Bending down to the victims, he began to check their vitals. He could detect a pulse in neither Jason nor Heather, although it appeared to him that both Aaron and Brad were attempting to breathe. Lynch used his radio to advise dispatch that there were 4 code blue victims at the scene, implying that each was at least in cardiac arrest. Immediately, every available unit responded. Crime scene investigator Kevin Brasser was next to arrive at the soccer field. He immediately began to locate and photograph evidence. A few minutes later, at 12:54 a.m., EMS arrived on the scene and further examined the victims, while police officers continued to comb the area for additional evidence. Investigators were able to locate on the snow-covered soccer field spent cartridge casings, bullet fragments, an ATM receipt reflecting a withdrawal at 1:17 that morning, and pieces of HG's plastic hair clip. Police and emergency medical support, meanwhile, arrived at the Johnson home, where HG once again relayed the horrific details of the recent events to police. She was checked and treated by medical personnel, then transported to a local hospital emergency room with what appeared to be non-life-threatening injuries. HG had suffered a gunshot wound to the back of her head. The impact fractured her skull, but, in a miraculous turn of events, the bullet did not penetrate into her brain, apparently because it had been deflected by the plastic hair clip she was wearing. She also had bruises on her face, frostbite on her feet, multiple lacerations to her body, and several injuries resulting from the repeated sexual assaults. The extent of HG's injuries, exposure to the icy temperatures of the brutal mid-December Kansas weather, and the physical and mental torture she had endured over the course of the 4 preceding hours made HG's survival efforts even more heroic. Despite the personal trauma and the loss of 4 friends, HG's focus was not on the extent of her own injuries, but rather on the capture of the offending brothers. She showed extraordinary courage in the face of her horrific ordeal, and, according to several police officers dispatched to the various crime scenes, hers is the single most heroic story of which they had ever heard. With H.G.'s vivid recall of the events, the investigation into the ghastly happenings of December 14th and 15th, as well as the hunt for the perpetrators, were now underway. "3 a.m. to 3:59 a.m. Wichita Police Detective Michael Dean had already arrived at the crime scene at 12727 Birchwood Drive. He was expecting to be joined at the house by Sergeant John Hoofer, but as Hoofer was on his way, a Dodge Dakota pickup truck, matching the description of the vehicle that had been put out over the police radio, passed him, heading in the opposite direction. Hoofer turned his vehicle around and began his pursuit. Unfortunately, the sergeant lost sight of the truck and turned his cruiser around to head back toward Birchwood Drive. He arrived at 3:19 a.m. and met Officer Dean, who had waited for the sergeant to arrive before entering the house. They did not expect to see what they found. The home had been ransacked. Drawers were dislodged from the bedroom dressers. Clothes were strewn about, and the beds were stripped of their linens. The entertainment center in the living room had an open space where a television would have been, and a coaxial cable had been pulled through the open space and was lying on the floor. The lower level had also been ransacked. There was a computer desk with no computer on it, and there was a large pool of blood on the corner of the mattress and what appeared to be a bullet hole. The police also discovered the body of a dead dog. The officers departed the house and properly secured it as a crime scene. While the evening's sole survivor was being treated at the hospital, Jonathan Carr was planning his alibi, not to the police, as it is doubtful the notion of being caught ever crossed his mind, but rather to his girlfriend Tronda Adams. At 3:31 a.m., Jonathan phoned her, indicating that he missed a 2:30 a.m. train he had hoped to take to Cleveland, Ohio. He asked if he could spend the night at her place, and Tronda, though sharing the home with her mother, obliged without hesitation. He arrived at Tronda's home at 3:45 a.m., still wearing the same clothes he donned during the attacks. The same clothes, in fact, that he wore when he and Reginald departed Adams's house in search of a victim at 9:30 p.m. on December 14th. "Can you change a $20 bill for some ones?" Carr asked Tronda, pulling a wad of cash, totaling at least $500 from his pocket. "Where did you get all that money?" she asked incredulously. She had never seen Jonathan with so much cash before. "I took all my money from the bank before leaving town," he responded. Tronda thought this explanation odd, knowing that he had been unemployed and was from Dodge City, not Wichita. She really didn't give it much thought beyond that, however. 4 a.m. Officer Dean was still standing by his patrol car in front of the 12727 Birchwood Drive residence when he observed a 1988 Plymouth driving toward the crime scene. He took note of the vehicle immediately, especially because there was no other traffic in this otherwise quiet and secluded neighborhood. Typically, there might be an isolated car or two traveling these roads at 4 in the morning, but with the slick, snow-covered street conditions that existed, he found the presence of a vehicle even more unusual. He paid particular attention as the vehicle rolled past him, taking note of everything he could. The driver was a black male wearing a stocking cap. He stared straight ahead as he passed by Dean. He made no eye contact and didn't acknowledge the officer in any way, nor did he bother to turn his head to gawk at the crime scene, something that very rarely, if ever, happens. If not for a heightened sense of awareness, Dean may have thought the man simply suffered from an amazing lack of curiosity. But there were other things that caught the officer's attention as he made a mental note of the Ford County license plate number. As the driver completed a U-turn heading onto 127th Street and back in the direction from which it came, Dean notified Sergeant Hoofer that he needed to make a traffic stop so as to identify the driver. 4:13 a.m. to 4:29 a.m. Hoofer pulled the white Plymouth over at 4:15 a.m. as it was driving on 127th Street away from the area of the crime scene. He asked the driver for his license and registration, but his attention focused on the black leather coat that was laying across the car's rear seat. "Where are you heading?" Hoofer inquired. "Stephanie Donnelly's apartment. She's my girlfriend," the driver answered, as he handed the officer the requested information. The license indicated that the man was Reginald Carr from Dodge City. From the description Reginald offered of Donnelly's apartment complex, however, Hoofer recognized its location as the 5400 block of East 21st Street, the Windsor at Woodgate Apartments. Hofer made some small talk and handed the license and registration back to Carr, who drove away immediately. Jonathan, meanwhile, was still cultivating his plans. At 4:25 a.m., he made a phone call to Dodge City, and at 4:26, he phoned his sister, waking her from a deep slumber. He told her that Reginald was coming over to trade cars with her, at about the same time that Jonathan was formulating his shallow plan to cover up his crimes. The press was gathering at the home of Sander, Heike, and Befort. Rumors of the horrendous acts perpetrated by the Carr brothers were beginning to leak, and it wasn't long before virtually every news station arrived at the crime scene. Investigative reporter Chris Coble noted that every station was going live from the scene and disseminating information as they received it because everyone in the press knew that the two suspects were still running free, armed and extremely dangerous. All three major news stations reported on the pickup truck, the stolen television and engagement ring, and every other relevant and known detail of the gruesome events. The news was being reported in real time, and the coverage was wall-to-wall because it was a developing situation. As people awoke on the morning of Friday, December 15th, they were inundated with reports of the vicious home invasion, assaults, and murders. The arrest of Reginald Carr. Approximately 4:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. Reginald Carr arrived at his girlfriend's apartment. He stayed only about 15 minutes before driving off, but returned again at 5:30 a.m. It was just about at that time that another resident of the Woodgate complex, Christian Taylor, turned on the local news as he prepared for work. He took note of the report of the murders, which indicated that the gunman escaped in a silver Dodge Dakota pickup truck. Taylor left his apartment at just about 6:25 a.m., making his way to his own vehicle. As he did so, he noticed that there was a Dodge Dakota pickup truck fitting the description of the one mentioned on the news, parked on the other side of the empty space next to his car. The tailgate of the pickup truck was down, and a large TV was sitting in its bed. A black man, later identified as Reginald Carr, emerged from behind the truck. He appeared to be in his 20s or 30s, had facial hair representing a few days' growth, and he wore blue jeans and a dark leather jacket. A scarf or hood covered his head. Taylor grew suspicious. He got in his car and headed to the nearby police station to report what he had seen. At about the same time, Riwa Obosangalafu, another resident at the complex, walked out of the building to warm up his car. As he did so, he saw Reginald Carr, a man he did not recognize, dragging a large television on a blanket toward building number 8. He, too, spotted the Dodge Dakota with its tailgate down. Reginald asked Sangalafu if he could help carry the TV into the apartment he had just rented. Sangalafu initially declined, but eventually agreed, and the two men carried the large screen TV up a set of stairs and into apartment 819. Carr indicated that he could get it into the apartment himself and offered to pay Sangalafu for his help. Reginald pulled a wad of folded bills from his pocket, but Riwa refused the money. Before Sangalafu had departed the hallway, Carr knocked on the apartment door and Donnelly opened it, asking where he had been all night, noting that she had been waiting for him. Carr made up a lie about his brother Jonathan seeing a married woman. When her husband caught them in the act, Reginald continued, the man began shooting at Jonathan, causing him to run off. Reginald also said he had to clean some of his stuff out of his sister's garage and needed to bring them to Donnelly's apartment. At some point, Carr pulled about $900 out of his pocket, showing it to his girlfriend before undressing and heading into the shower. Donnelly noticed that Carr removed a pair of red shorts, the same ones he had been wearing under his pants the previous evening. While Sangalafu was helping Carr carry the stolen television up the stairs to the second-floor hallway, a police officer investigating the report that Taylor had filed discovered the Dodge pickup truck just as Taylor had described it. He followed the footprints and drag marks in the snow from the car to the sidewalk in front of the apartment complex, where he found a discarded multicolored comforter. He also observed some clothing that had been thrown over the fence not far from the truck, and a blue and white striped comforter in a trash dumpster next to the pickup truck. All these items were later identified as having been taken from the crime scene. As the police officer was inspecting the grounds, Sangalafu walked out of the apartment complex. The officer stopped to ask him some questions, and Sangalafu noted that he was on his way to work, but had stopped to help a man move a large TV from the truck to an apartment in Building 8. Upon request, Sangalafu accompanied the officer to the hallway outside of apartment 819. Jamie Crouch, one of the other police officers who responded to the Windsor at Woodgate apartments, took a position outside the balcony of apartment 819 while two other officers knocked on the apartment door, announcing themselves as the police. Stephanie Donnelly, Reginald's pretty, white, dark-haired girlfriend, opened the door. Police officer Renee Bryant entered. A few seconds later, the apartment's sliding glass door leading to the rear balcony opened. Reginald Carr emerged from the apartment and placed his hands on a balcony railing as if he were going to jump from the balcony to the ground. Realizing that it was too high of a jump and noticing police standing below, Carr returned to the apartment where Officer Bryant placed him under arrest at 7:30 a.m. On his person was Jason Befort's gas card, Heather Muller's watch, and $996 in cash, $980 of which was in crisp $20 bills, the type of which might be dispensed from an ATM. Police also discovered Brad Hake's large-screen TV, wallet, and watch, Jason Befort's checkbook, Aaron Sanders' garment bag and computer, clothing, and jewelry. In addition, they found HG's credit card. During the course of the apartment search, the police retrieved Reginald Carr's leather coat, a glove, and a stocking cap. The pocket of the coat contained ATM receipts showing early morning withdrawals from the account of Brad Hake. The search of the pickup truck revealed more incriminating evidence, including Jason Befort's ATM card, wallet, and driver's license, as well as several ATM receipts showing withdrawals from Jason's account at 12:31 and from HG's account at 12:53 that morning. The police were certain that they had at least one of the murderers. As the sun began to rise, about 90 minutes prior to Carr's arrest, Wichita Police Lieutenant John Spear was at the crime scene at 12727 Birchwood Drive. A woman approached him and identified herself as Lois Muller, Heather Muller's mom. "My daughter never came home last night," she said. "Is she okay?" She asked the question, already fearing the worst. "I'm sorry," were the only words Lieutenant Spear could manage to say. Mrs. Muller then asked if Aaron was okay. "No, he's not okay," Spear said. The veteran officer would later say of the exchange, "You're watching people's souls die right in front of you." The arrest of Jonathan Carr, approximately 7:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Tronda Adams, meanwhile, was watching the morning news when the report of a quadruple murder caught her attention. The newscaster said that police were looking for two suspects, one wearing an orange FUBU shirt. Alarmed, Adams awakened Jonathan with the news, eager to gauge his reaction. He showed no emotion, indicating that he knew nothing of the murders. She questioned him further, noting that the report told of the gunman taking the victims to ATMs, forcing them to withdraw cash. That seemed to get Jonathan's attention. "How do the police know that?" he inquired. "One of the victims survived," she told him. Jonathan had to know that this wasn't good news for him. Tony Green had gone to her job as a home health care professional earlier in the morning, but felt a bit queasy and left for home. Green is Tronda's mother, but she was unaware that Jonathan Carr had been courting her daughter for about a week. By about 11 in the morning, she was feeling a bit better and started to clean the apartment. That's when she stumbled upon a maroon jewelry box containing a diamond engagement ring in one of the pockets of Jonathan's jacket. She logically assumed that it was intended for Jonathan's girlfriend in Ohio and immediately returned it to the coat pocket of the man who was sleeping on her couch. At noon, Tondra took off her shoes and sat down to watch the news, hoping for an update on the quadruple murder. Jonathan, now awake, though still sprawled out on the couch, and Tony were also in the living room. There on the screen was video coverage of Reginald Carr being arrested. Adams grew concerned and immediately told Jonathan to accompany her downstairs. "Did you just see that report?" she inquired of him. "I did," he responded rather pensively. In the face of additional questions from Tondra, Jonathan stuck to his original lie, insisting that after missing his train, he was just hanging around, drinking at his sister's house. Tondra was not buying it. "You were wearing the orange FUBU sweater, and the police already have your brother," she said. Jonathan became visibly upset and started to cry. Several miles away, Andrew Schreiber, the first of the Carr brothers' kidnap and robbery victims, also tuned into the noon report and saw a face that was sickeningly familiar. Schreiber phoned police to say he thought Reginald was one of the men who robbed him. Tondra's mother was still upstairs watching the news, and while she didn't make the connection between Reginald and Jonathan, she learned from the report that a diamond engagement ring was one of the items stolen in the robbery and attacks. She also learned the police were looking for a white Plymouth, a car similar to the one she had seen parked outside the apartment earlier that morning. Looking outside, she observed the car in the same spot. She yelled for her still barefoot daughter to come upstairs, where she whispered that she believed the police were looking for Jonathan and that they needed to leave immediately. She relayed to her daughter the story about the engagement ring in Jonathan's pocket and the presence of the white Plymouth parked outside. Tondra was convinced and started looking for her shoes. "You can leave without your shoes," her frantic mother urged. "Let's go." Green grabbed her niece, who had been staying with them, and together, the three women left the building and ran across the street to the apartment of neighbor Donika Buggs, telling her to call the police. As Tondra looked back toward her apartment, she saw Jonathan standing at the front door with a confused look, wondering why Tondra was across the way. He was still wearing the orange FUBU sweater. As the bewildered Carr stood in the doorway, police arrived. Carr quietly moved back into the apartment, removed the FUBU sweater, and slipped out of the front door, running toward an alley. Police immediately began pursuit and apprehended him at 12:33 p.m., 2 blocks away from Green's home, hiding between a house's storm door and front door. Carr had lost one of his shoes in the chase. In his pocket was in excess of $1,000 in cash. Returning to Tondra's apartment, police discovered the orange FUBU sweater, leather gloves, a brown leather jacket containing the engagement ring Jason Beaufort intended for HG, and Jonathan's identification card. Several additional items were retrieved from Jonathan's car, including 2 clocks belonging to Brad Haka. Making an evidentiary case against the Carr brothers. Approximately 1:01 p.m. to 5 p.m. As a matter of routine in the arrest process for capital crimes, warrants are issued for bodily specimens. In the arrest of Jonathan Carr, police certainly followed that protocol. While he was being transported to the hospital by a police officer and Detective Kelly Otis, Carr asked the detective about a quadruple homicide that took place in Wichita a week earlier at the hands of other criminals. Those suspects were arrested and charged with capital murder, the detective said. Carr asked what that meant, and when he told that it was a crime to which the death penalty was applied, he asked how the death penalty was administered. The detective responded that a convicted criminal receives a lethal injection. "Do they feel anything from that?" Jonathan inquired after a long pause. "We've never been able to ask anyone," Otis replied. Once at the hospital, medical staff extracted hair, blood, and saliva samples from Carr, pursuant to the warrant for DNA evidence. Police hope to match these samples to any DNA evidence that might be found at 12727 Birchwood Drive, at the soccer field, in the vehicles, and on the victims. Approximately 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. At 6:30 p.m., police were able to show HG 2 photo arrays. She was asked if she could identify any of the people in the pictures as the intruders. Pointing to a man in position number 2 of the first photo array, HG indicated that the man's features, including his eyes and his hair, betrayed him as one of the men who attacked her. That man to whom she had pointed was Reginald Carr. She incorrectly identified the second gunman, however, thinking the man in the number 1 position of the second photo array had the buckwheat-style hair that she recalled on her other captor. Jonathan Carr, however, was in position number 4 of that array. A bit later in the evening, about 7:15 p.m., detectives investigating the crimes visited Ann Walenta, the Carr brothers' first shooting victim, who was still hospitalized from the wounds inflicted in the December 11 attack. Police presented her with a photographic lineup card that included both Carr brothers. The recovering woman picked out Reginald as the man who shot her. She pointed to another man who rang a bell of familiarity. He was not Jonathan, but a man in prison at the time of her assault. The result of the witness identification presented a problem for the prosecutors. While all 3 eyewitnesses, Andrew Schreiber, Ann Walenta, and HG, identified Reginald Carr as a perpetrator, none of the 3 were able to positively identify Jonathan Carr as a participant in the crimes. He could offer any number of excuses as to how he came to be in possession of the engagement ring and some of the other items that seemed incriminating. But without victim identification placing him at the scene at the time of the rapes, sexual assaults, robberies, and murders, The police knew prosecutors would have a difficult time getting a conviction of Jonathan on any of those counts. Despite the concerns, prosecutors charged both Reginald and Jonathan Carr with 103 crimes, including 5 counts of capital murder and multiple counts of rape and robbery. They were also charged with animal cruelty. Each of the brothers had been charged with the same 50 counts of the crime spree that lasted 9 days. Reginald Carr had been charged with an additional 3 counts for being a felon in possession of a firearm. Evidence collected in the days and years following December 15, 2000. The autopsies. The medical examiner in Kansas performed autopsies on the bodies of the 4 Carr shooting victims who had died as a result of their attacks. The reports will be used as evidence in the trial of the accused and to provide to law enforcement officers and the prosecution team answers to several outstanding questions that may help in their quest to prosecute the Carr brothers. The autopsy reports concluded Heather Muller died of a contact gunshot wound to her head. Her body showed bruising on her lower extremities. Injuries to her genital area were consistent with the application of force, and injuries to her knees were consistent with being placed on her hands and knees for the purpose of sexual intercourse. Aaron Sander died of a contact gunshot wound to his head. He sustained blunt trauma injuries to his head and neck, and his legs showed bruises, red discoloration, and scrapes. Injuries on his forehead and head were consistent with being hit with a golf club and the gun associated with the murders. Jason Beaufort died of an intermediate-range gunshot wound to his head. In addition, his body showed blunt trauma injuries. An injury to his buttocks was consistent with being hit with a golf club. Brad Haka died of an intermediate-range gunshot wound to his head. His face showed blunt trauma injuries. All of the gunshot wounds to the 4 Birchwood murder victims were consistent with their bodies being in a kneeling position with their heads down when the bullets entered their skulls. HG's dog sustained severe injury and fracturing of the neck, almost to the point where the head had fallen down off of the support of the spinal cord and vertebrae, consistent with being struck with a golf club. The dog also sustained a puncture wound to its neck. Finding the murder weapon. March 19, 2001. A Winfield Correctional Facility inmate was working a cleanup detail near the intersection of Kansas Highway 96 and Greenwich Road in Wichita when he noticed something peculiar in the grass. He walked closer and discovered a Lorson .380 caliber handgun lying there. He immediately called for his supervisor. The gun was collected and passed up the chain of command. It was eventually sent for ballistics testing, the result of which demonstrated that all of the bullets, casings, and fragments associated with the Schreiber, Walenta, and Birchwood Drive incidents came from the Lorson .380 handgun. This included a casing found at the scene where Schreiber was left by his abductors, bullets and casings from Walenta's Yukon, a bullet from Walenta's chest, casings and a bullet fragment found at 29th and Greenwich Road, and a bullet from the body of Aaron Sander. Tronda Adams identified the Lorson .380 as the black handgun that Jonathan Carr had given her the evening of December 11, 2000, and that she had returned to him on December 12, 2000.
Count 2, which is multiple homicides occurring during the same common scheme and plan.
Another woman survived the attack and testified against the Carr brothers.